The 5 most powerful men in the Bible. Number 5, Melchizedek.
Who was Melchizedek? Melchizedek was an enigmatic figure who appeared briefly on the stage of human history, then disappeared. Despite being one of the least mentioned and most mysterious individuals in the Old Testament, Melchizedek, the king priest of Salem, is foundational in understanding key concepts in the Bible. The question is, who exactly is this mysterious figure? What does this dynamic order tell us about Christ's role as a king and a priest? In Hebrew, his name means King of Righteousness, or My King is Righteous. The first mention of this name can be dated about 2 millennia before Christ, the second around 1 millennium before Jesus was born, and the third in the second half of the 1st century after the birth of Jesus. Abraham and Melchizedek. Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and 3 allied kings went to battle against 5 kings who governed territories near the Dead Sea. It was a victory for the 4 kings. They took goods, food, and materials from Sodom and Gomorrah. From among the citizens of Sodom, they took away Lot with family and possessions. Then a survivor who had escaped from the invading forces on the other side of the Jordan came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living in the terebinth oaks of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, and brother of Anna. They were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his nephew Lot had been captured, he armed and let out his trained men, born in his own house, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far north as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and attacked and defeated them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his nephew Lot and his possessions, and also the women and the people. Genesis 14, 13-16, Amplified Bible. Abraham was greeted by the king of Sodom upon his return from battle. He refused to take anything from the king when he offered him goods. Abraham refused any part of the loot because he would not allow anyone say that they made him rich. He determined that God alone should be credited for all of his success and wealth. However, from Melchizedek, Abraham received bread and wine and a blessing from God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Genesis 14, 18-22, Amplified Bible. Melchizedek, king of Salem, ancient Jerusalem, brought out bread and wine for them. He was the priest of God Most High. And Melchizedek blessed Abram and said, Blessed, joyful, favored be Abram by God Most High, creator and possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed, praised, and glorified be God Most High, who has given your enemies into your hands. And Abram gave him 1/10 of all the treasure he had taken in battle. The king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the people and keep the goods, spoils of battle for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand and sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, the creator and possessor of heaven and earth. This man was king of Salem, as we see in Psalm 76:2, where we read, His tabernacle is in Salem, Jerusalem. His dwelling place is in Zion. We have no clue of where Melchizedek arrived from, how he came to be in Canaan, how he became to be a worshipper and priest of the true God, and how Abram came to know about him. The only thing we know is that he was there. Melchizedek was both a king and a priest, which made him unique. Historically, combining religious authority with civic authority has often been dangerous. God forbade the kings of Israel to the priests and the priests to be kings. Leprosy struck King Uzziah when he attempted to do the work of a priest in 2 Chronicles 26:16-23. The exception was Melchizedek. They opposed King Uzziah and said to him, It is not for you, Uzziah, to turn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who have been consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful, and will have no honor from the Lord God. 2 Chronicles 26:18. Melchizedek was God's most high priest, El Elyon signifies highest God, like saying supreme being. The priest Melchizedek worshipped God Most High without being related to Abraham or any other known convent, people of God, but he worshipped the true God. Melchizedek served Abram bread and wine. We read, "He was the priest of God Most High." Melchizedek, as priest, did two things. He blessed Abraham and he blessed God. Melchizedek showed that a priest must associate with God and man and have a ministry to God and man. Despite looking obscure, Melchizedek plays an important role in the Old Testament. Many have speculated he might have been Noah's son Seth, or even an angel, and some have even imagined he was an unfallen Adam sent to observe God's work of redemption. We have no concrete biblical foundation to confirm this. The question cannot be said to be settled completely. Otherwise, the identity of Melchizedek would have been agreed on by Bible scholars long ago. Morris. We can say with confidence that Melchizedek is a remarkable type or picture of Jesus. We read, "And he gave him a tithe of all." This referred to a tenth of his assets, not his income. There was almost a competition between Abraham and Melchizedek to see who could bless the other the most. Abraham blessed Melchizedek out of his resources, and Melchizedek blessed Abram out of his resources. Our community of believers should have this attitude of mutual blessing. It's also been suggested that Melchizedek was an angel who administered judgment. Others have equated Melchizedek with Shem. The theories are all speculative, however. David writing about Melchizedek. David composed a psalm about a millennium after Abraham describing his Lord as both king and priest. In the first verse of this psalm, the Lord invited David's Lord to sit at his right hand in royal splendor. Psalms 110:4. The Lord has sworn an oath and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. We read, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." He vowed that the Messiah had an eternal priesthood and that it was after the pattern order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek wasn't just an everyday worshipper of the true God. He held a respected position as the priest of the Most High God, a title that highlights his significance. The grandeur of God elevated the prestige of Melchizedek's priesthood, making him a noteworthy figure in history. There is no mention of any father or mother of Melchizedek, and he appeared without any genealogy. We read, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." Through this oath, God showed that there is another kind of priest that is different from the priest of Aaron. The priests of Israel were all from Aaron's family, and they used to work in the tabernacle, later in the temple, offering sacrifices and doing ceremonies according to God's rules. Here we see that God established another priestly order, after the pattern of Melchizedek. This oath was so important that the author of Hebrews refers to it 5 times. His priesthood is not like that of Aaron, figurative, successive, and transient, but real and effectual, fixed and incommunicable, eternal and unchangeable. Horn. One of the extraordinary features of the kingdom is that the Lord Jesus will combine in his person the dual offices of king and priest. This might be dangerous when regular leaders do it. That's why people want to keep religion and government separate. This is something that the world has wanted for a long time, but has never known. In verse 4, we learn 4 things concerning the priesthood of the Messiah. He was made a priest by the oath of Jehovah. This appointment was irrevocable. His priesthood is eternal. It is according to the order of Melchizedek. The phrase, according to the order of Melchizedek, is interpreted for us in Hebrews 5:7. There, the priesthood of Melchizedek is compared and contrasted with the Aaronic and Levitical priesthood. The priesthood of that mysterious personage, Melchizedek, was by sovereign appointment of God. It was not inherited from his parents, and there is no mention of his priesthood ever beginning or ending, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. In these and other ways, the Melchizedekan priesthood was superior to that of Levi. Melchizedek was a prototype of the Lord Jesus. Our Lord's priesthood was not a matter of parentage. He was of the tribe of Judah, not Levi. His priesthood was established by the sovereign eternal decree of God, and since he lives in the power of an endless life, his priesthood will never end. Another way in which Melchizedek foreshadowed the Messiah is that he was both king and priest. His name and title signify that he was king of righteousness and king of peace. He was also priest of God Most High. The Book of Hebrews and Melchizedek. The writer of the epistles to the Hebrew was the only author in the New Testament who set forth the principles of Christ's priesthood. Paul made one indirect connection to his priesthood. Paul wrote that Christ is seated at God's right hand as king and is interceding for his people as priest. The author of Hebrews, by contrast, devoted nearly his entire epistle to the priesthood of the Son of God. Christ purifies his people from their sins. Hebrews 2:17. Therefore it was essential that he had to be made like his brothers, mankind, in every respect, so that he might by experience become a powerful and faithful high priest in things related to God, to make atonement, propitiation for the people's sins, thereby wiping away the sin, satisfying divine justice and providing a way of reconciliation between God and mankind. He is designated by God as priest in the order of Melchizedek, and became a priest in this order when God swore an oath. Hebrews 6:20, where Jesus has entered in advance as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Christ entered the most holy place once for all in the presence of God and sat down at God's right hand when he had offered one sacrifice for sins once for all. Hebrews 10:12. Whereas Christ, having offered the one sacrifice, the all-sufficient sacrifice of himself, for sins for all time, sat down, signifying the completion of atonement for sin, at the right hand of God, the position of honor. In Hebrews 7, the writer emphasizes the superiority of the Melchizedekian priesthood over Levitical priesthood. Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High, which meant that he was a king of righteousness, Zedek, and peace, Salem. In addition to ruling as king, Melchizedek was a priest without genealogy. Hebrews 7, Amplified Bible. For this, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham as he returned from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, and Abraham gave him 1/10 of all the spoil. He is, first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem, which means King of Peace. Without any record of father or mother, nor ancestral line, without any record of beginning of days, birth, nor ending of life, death, but having been made like the Son of God, he remains a priest without interruption and without successor. Now pause and consider how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave 1/10 of the spoils. It is true that those descendants of Levi who are charged with the priestly office are commanded in the law to collect tithes from the people, which means from their kinsmen, though they have descended from Abraham. But this person, Melchizedek, who is not from their Levitical ancestry, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who possessed the promise of God. Yet it is beyond all dispute that the lesser person is always blessed by the greater one. Furthermore, here in the Levitical priesthood, tithes are received by men who are subject to death, but in that case concerning Melchizedek, they are received by one of whom it is testified that he lives on perpetually. A person might even say that Levi, the father of the priestly tribe himself who received tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, the father of all Israel and of all who believe, for Levi was still in the loins, unborn, of his forefather Abraham, when Melchizedek met him, Abraham. Now if perfection, a perfect fellowship between God and the worshipper, had been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people were given the law, What further need was there for another and different kind of priest to arise, one in the manner of Melchizedek, rather than one appointed to the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is a necessity of a change in the law concerning the priesthood as well. For the one of whom these things are said belonged, not to the priestly line of Levi, but to another tribe, from which no one has officiated or served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord descended from the tribe of Judah, and Moses mentioned nothing about priests in connection with that tribe. And this becomes even more evident if another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of physical and legal requirement in the law concerning his ancestry as a descendant of Levi, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible and endless life, for it is attested by God of him. You, Christ, are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is cancelled because of its weakness and uselessness, because of its inability to justify the sinner before God. For the law never made anything perfect, while on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we are now continually drawn near to God. And indeed, it was not without the taking of an oath that Christ was made a priest. For those Levites who formerly became priests received their offices without it being confirmed by the taking of an oath. But this one was designated with an oath through the one who said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind or regret it. You, Christ, are a priest forever." And so, because of the oath's greater strength and force, Jesus has become the certain guarantee of a better covenant, a more excellent and more advantageous agreement, one that will never be replaced or annulled. The former successive line of priests, on the one hand, existed in greater numbers because they were each prevented by death from continuing perpetually in office. But on the other hand, Jesus holds his priesthood permanently and without change, because he lives on forever. Therefore, he is able also to save forever, completely, perfectly for eternity, those who come to God through him, since he always lives to intercede and intervene on their behalf with God. It was fitting for us to have such a high priest, perfectly adapted to our needs, holy, blameless, unstained by sin, separated from sinners and exalted higher than the heavens, who has no day-by-day need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices, first of all for his own personal sins, and then for those of the people, because he met all the requirements and did this once for all when he offered up himself as a willing sacrifice. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, frail, sinful, dying men, but the word of the oath of God, which came after the institution of the law, permanently appoints as priest a son who has been made perfect forever. The high priest Jesus is distinctive in the way he carries out his duties compared to the Levitical priests. He doesn't have to perform sacrifices on a daily basis, because he did it once and for all. He also doesn't have to make sacrifices for his own sins, as he is without sin. One of the most astounding ways in which he differs from the previous priests is that he willingly sacrificed himself for the sins of the people. He offered himself as the ultimate sacrifice. The grace of Jesus is truly unpaired and excellent. The law sets up priests who are personally imperfect. They are characterized by weakness and failure. They're only ritually holy. God's oath, given after the law, appoints the Son as a priest who has been perfected forever. This oath was referred to in verse 21 of this chapter and quoted from Psalms 110:4. There are meaningful implications in what we have just covered. The way priests used to do things in the old days is not how we do it anymore. We have a divine and eternal priest now. It would be silly for people to try to copy the old way of doing things and try to introduce upon the functions of our great high priest.
Abraham, a man of grit, courage, and faith. We often think of Abraham as a nice old man, the patriarch of faith who heard God's voice to move to a new place and simply moved because he trusted God's voice. But have we considered how much courage, grit, hard work and tenacity it must have taken Abraham to not just move at that advanced age, but to also start a new business, establish new roots, and raise his family the way God commanded him to. Yes, he is often referred to as the father of faith, and that is a precious attribute to emulate. However, we must also study his work ethic and his approach to different projects God gave him. Ecclesiastes 10 verse 18. Through laziness the rafters sag, because of idle hands the house leaks. In fact, one thing to know about faith is that it drives the one who believes to get started in preparation for the word that has gone ahead. Faith is not just confessing and claiming as many of us have reduced it to. Rather, it is a dynamic force that stops us from being passive like we used to be in times past. James chapter 2. In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds." Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Faith sets us on our feet and ensures that we obey in faith. As it is explained in the New Testament, we prove our faith by our subsequent works. This is why as soon as God promised Abraham a good land that would flourish and be abundant for him and his seed after him, he didn't lay in his hut, hoping that God's word will become a reality when God was ready. Rather, he started giving his best to every work that was before him, working hard because he trusted that God would cause all that was around him to flourish. God's covenant and promise is usually not for the faint-hearted or people that are lethargic, because no matter the prophecy of greatness on our lives, there is still a place in a walk of faith for preparation before we see the manifestation of all that has been declared. The instruction of God to Abraham to move to an unknown destination was no doubt very demanding and enough to put anyone under a lot of pressure. But thankfully, Abraham was a courageous man with a lot of inner strength. When God says he should move, it meant he had to take everything that belonged to him and set out on a journey that involved moving for days. He didn't even know when or where to stop until God says so. Genesis 12, verses 1 to 10, Amplified, says, "Now in Haran the Lord had said to Abram, 'Go away from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you abundantly, and make your name great, exalted, distinguished. And you shall be a blessing, a source of great good to others. And I will bless, do good for, benefit, those who bless you. And I will curse, that is, subject to my wrath and judgment, the one who curses, despises, dishonors, has contempt for you. And in you all the families or nations of the earth will be blessed.' So Abram departed in faithful obedience, as the Lord had directed him. And Lot, his nephew, left with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, and all their possessions which they had acquired, and the people, servants, which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, to the great terebinth oak tree of Moreh. Now the Canaanites were in the land at that time. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'I will give this land to your descendants.' So Abram built an altar there to honor the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he moved on from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord, and called on the name of the Lord, in worship through prayer, praise, and thanksgiving. Then Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev, the south country of Judah. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to live temporarily, for the famine in the land was oppressive and severe. It was a tasking and tiring journey for an old man, yet he kept going because he had the grit necessary to become a father of many nations, and he wasn't scared of the work that would come with moving. It wasn't as if God was trying to punish Abraham, but in this kingdom, God likes to teach us by seeing us get involved in the process. Abraham continued with the journey because God didn't tell him that he had gotten to his final destination. Genesis 13, verses 1 to 6 and 17 to 18, Amplified. So Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot his nephew went with him into the Negev, the south country of Judah. Now Abram was extremely rich in livestock, and in silver and in gold. He journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, where he had first built an altar. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord in prayer. But Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support him, that is, sustain all their grazing and water needs, while they lived near one another, for their possessions were too great for them to stay together. Arise, walk, make a thorough reconnaissance around in the land, through its length and its width, for I will give it to you. Then Abram broke camp and moved his tent, and came and settled by the grove of the great terebinths, oak trees of Mamre, the Amorite, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to honor the Lord. Even at 75 years of age, Abraham still went out to fight in a war with his servants. Only a strong man would do that. Another promise came from God after Lot separated himself from Abraham. Naturally, at this point, it would be normal for most people to relax and forget about working. After all, he had more than enough to eat and a house to live in. But he chose to press into the full purpose of God with full steam. Genesis 17, verses 1 to 14, Amplified, says, "When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk habitually before me with integrity, knowing that you are always in my presence, and be blameless and complete in obedience to me. I will establish my covenant, my everlasting promise between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly through your descendants." Then Abram fell on his face in worship, and God spoke with him, saying, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and as a result, you shall be the father of many nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, exalted father, but your name shall be Abraham, father of a multitude. For I will make you the father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, moving from place to place, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession of property, and I will be their God." Further, God said to Abraham, "As for you, your part of the agreement, you shall keep and faithfully obey the terms of my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is the sign of my covenant, which you shall keep and faithfully obey, between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be the sign, symbol, memorial of the covenant between me and you. Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations, including a servant, whether born in the house or one who is purchased with your money from any foreigner, who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house or one who is purchased with your money must be circumcised, and the sign of my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." First of all, circumcision requires a lot of effort, and secondly, circumcision is painful. However, Abraham started with himself and then proceeded to the same for every other male. Even his dedication and commitment to the prophecy God gave him became obvious in the way Isaac too loved the God of his father, walked in the way of truth, and gave his best to his work. It is for this reason that God's blessing, covenant, and promises were able to move on from Abraham to his son Isaac according to God's purpose. Genesis 18, verses 18 and 19. Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him, so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him.
Mere mention of the name Moses arouses different images in the minds of various folks. The death of Moses is shrouded in some mystery in the Bible. We know he died at the age of 120, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. Despite his age, Moses was still in his prime when he was called home. Moses was barred from entering the Promised Land because of his disobedience at the waters of Meribah Kadesh. He led the Israelites to the very edge of Canaan and was given a glimpse of the land, but he was not permitted to enter it. At the end of Moses' life, God gave Moses a glimpse of the land he had left Egypt for. Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah. Mount Pisgah has a summit elevation of 4,500 feet, and that's nearly a mile. There aren't many 120-year-old men who can climb a mountain nearly a mile high and live to tell the tale. However, Moses could. He managed it by scrambling hand over hand. There was no trail wide enough for Moses, and he didn't need one anyway. If you're wondering what condition he was in, that feat will tell you. Yet here was Moses, nearly a century and a quarter old, climbing to the top of a 4,500-foot-high peak and having a great time once there. Moses is not full of self-pity. He knew he would pass away since God had told him so, and the Lord had already set another man, Joshua, in his stead before he died. The weighty responsibility of guiding the nation was lifted from his shoulders for the very first time in the last 40 years of his life. Moses could take each step on the slope in stride with lightened shoulders. He was well aware that he was about to take his final breath at any moment. When it comes to the subject of death, Moses teaches us that a believer has no reason to be afraid or to rush out into the streets in a panicked state. Death is an inevitable part of existence for each and every one of us. Before we are truly prepared to live, we must first be prepared to pass away. Therefore, when we are ready to pass away, let us not delay and immediately do it. Imagine the breathtaking view that was spread out before him. Moses looked out, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and all Naphtali and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, and the Negev, and the plain in the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. That is what Moses was looking forward to as he took in this final visual feast of the Promised Land, a piece of real estate he would never set his feet upon. And that was it. God wanted him home. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord. Moses gave up the spirit. Whether we are heroes or not, we will all reach the point in our lives when we must abandon the body and pass on to another realm. Two different messages spring from this. The aloneness of death. Not its loneliness, but its aloneness. There's a difference. Loneliness suggests an empty longing, reaching in vain for someone else. Aloneness means nobody else goes along. That is what I see here. It's a solo flight. You never take a companion along when you travel through death. You go all alone. Everything is great, just as long as we don't have to be alone. Perhaps that what makes death so frightening to some. We are so seldom alone. On the other hand, Moses is all by himself atop Mount Pisgah. Joshua was not allowed to accompany them in any way, and Aaron had long since disappeared. On the rocky trek to the peak, where there was no discernible trail, there was just one solitary figure to be seen. The next thing that springs up is the security of death. Moses died according to the word of the Lord. The man's life came to an end precisely how God had planned it out all along. Moses passed away by himself, but in peace. The account of his passing is contained within the final 6 verses of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34. Death has a way of putting things in proper perspective, doesn't it? What a way to live. 120 and you don't need glasses. A century and a fifth and you don't need crutches. Moses never did sit around in a rocking chair rubbing on liniment and drinking Ensure. You can't help but wonder, did those Hebrews who often grumble about him adore him? Or was he just a convenient target who served as a lightning rod for their discontent? Were they inclined to think of him as some kind of distant, profound man of God? The answer is found in verse 8 when he died. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 8. So the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. Oh, how the Israelites will miss their late leader's wise counsel. His work among them stirred their emotions to such a degree that it took an entire month for them to mourn his passing after he had left them. But finally that mourning came to an end. That ought to be true in our own lives. After a death comes a burial. And so it was in the case of Moses. But verse 6 contains one of the most remarkable statements about the whole remarkable career of Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 6. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no man knows where his burial place is to this day. Moses is the only person in the Bible whom God personally buried. Did you realize that? The Lord then hid the tomb. What made him do that? Because that grave would have been turned into a shrine. They'd still be beating a path up Nebo today, erecting shrines, selling popcorn and peanuts, offering various rides, and maybe even running a tram up there with big banners proclaiming Moses' burial place. So it was concealed. This was so crucial to the Lord that it even sparked an angelic confrontation. Jude verse 9 contains one of the stranger accounts in the Bible concerning this event. Jude writes, But even the archangel Michael, when he was disputing with the devil, Satan, and arguing about the body of Moses, did not dare bring an abusive condemnation against him, but simply said, The Lord rebuke you. It would appear that the devil had his own ideas about what he could do with Moses' body, but God responded, Never. I claim ownership of his body in the same manner that I do his soul, and I intend for the grave to remain undiscovered for all time. The end of the story. All things have their proper wrap-up, as does the story of Moses. Since that time, there has not been another prophet who has arisen in Israel who is comparable to Moses, whom the Lord personally knew. This is due to all of the miracles and signs that the Lord commanded Moses to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all of his servants, and the entirety of Pharaoh's land, as well as due to all of the great terror and mighty power that Moses displayed in front of all of Israel. Famous French historian and philologist Joseph Renan once said of Moses, He is a colossus among figures of humanity. Renan was referring to Moses. The majority of us, when we read this portion of the epitaph and think about all of the enormous strength and of all the miracles that Moses did, have a tendency to think that Moses is in a league of his own. I can't touch him. This life, I've observed, amounts to just another theoretical study. It almost mocks me, because I'm not like Moses. Moses was clearly one of a kind, but at the end of the day, he was just a man serving God. Nonetheless, we can derive a great deal of personal gain from learning about his life and passing.
Solomon succeeded King David as the final king of the unified nation of Israel. Solomon asked the Lord for wisdom at Gibeon, the most famous high place. God began the proceedings by appearing to Solomon and making an incredible offer. "What should I give you?" Solomon's response demonstrated that, in some ways, he was wise beyond his years. When he became king, he was about 20 years old. The young man was aware of his shortcomings. He had no previous leadership experience, but had been appointed ruler of many people. What he required was a receptive heart to judge and lead them correctly. Realizing your desperate need for God is the first step toward becoming a kingdom man. God was so pleased that Solomon requested wisdom rather than long life or riches that he granted the request and added to it what Solomon did not ask for: riches, honor, and a long life. However, for these promised blessings to become a reality, Solomon would have to walk in the ways of the Lord and obey his statutes and commands. God's promises were sure, but they could only be obtained through obedience. The author of 1 Kings intended the story in this section to demonstrate the profound wisdom God had bestowed upon Solomon. It helps us see that wisdom is more than acquiring knowledge and understanding. Wisdom, on the other hand, is spiritual understanding applied to earthly living. God had given Solomon intelligence and the ability to see the world through a spiritual lens and use that lens to everyday life. The king acted as Israel's one-man supreme court, serving as the final level of appeal in difficult cases. This particular case involved a quandary between two prostitutes. Each of them had given birth to a child. The first woman claimed that the second woman's child died as a result of her sleeping on him. The second woman then placed her dead son next to the first woman and took her living son for herself while it was still dark. When the first woman awoke to find her child dead beside her, she realized he wasn't her son. The second woman vehemently denied it, claiming the exact opposite. 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 23 through 26, New King James Version. And the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son who lives, and your son is the one dead.' And the other says, 'No, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one.' Then the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' So they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, 'Divide the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other.' Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son, and she said, 'O my lord, give her the living son, and by no means kill him.' But the other said, 'Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him.' Without the assistance of a DNA test, the average judge would be perplexed by the case. Solomon, on the other hand, knew exactly what to do because of his God-given insight into the ways of human nature. He said to divide the living boy in half and distribute half to each woman. And, just as the king predicted, the baby's true mother begged for his life and was even willing to give him up. The other woman cruelly seconded the king's decision. Then the king gave his ruling. Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is the mother. When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. Solomon gave the living baby to the first woman after his unique solution to the dilemma was rewarded. The story quickly spread throughout Israel, and everyone was in awe of the king because they saw God's wisdom in him to carry out justice. Solomon's reputation as the wisest man who ever lived spread quickly, bringing God glory. Number 2, he was a prolific writer. Solomon became what we would call a Renaissance man as a result of God's blessing. There was no subject in which he did not possess unrivaled wisdom. He was a proverbial author, a song composer, and even a botanist and zoologist. 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 32 and 33, New King James Version. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Also he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish. Solomon penned the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and a large portion of Proverbs. His wisdom far surpassed that of all the people of the East, and all of Egypt's wisdom was significant because these regions were renowned for their wisdom. The author of Kings stated unequivocally that there was no comparison. Solomon was wiser than anyone. Furthermore, Solomon's reputation was well known. The surrounding nations came to know and respect Israel's king. Every king on the planet dispatched emissaries to hear Solomon's wisdom. God's kingdom was blessing the kingdoms of the world. 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 through 34, New King James Version. And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding, and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Shalcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Also he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish. And men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Number 4. His great reputation. It was typical of a king to send emissaries to Solomon. However, this queen came to confirm the words she had heard. The fame of Solomon had spread quickly. The story of the Queen of Sheba exemplifies this point. It also demonstrates that God was blessing the world's peoples through his people, just as he had promised Abraham. The Queen of Sheba paid a visit to Solomon's court. She was from an Arabian kingdom in what is now Yemen. Her country was about 1,200 miles from Jerusalem. The queen came to see Solomon because of his fame associated with the name of the Lord, which was most likely a reference to the wisdom that the Lord had bestowed upon him. She came to put him to the test with riddles to see if his abilities lived up to his reputation. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 1, New King James Version. Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She wasn't exactly a pauper herself, bringing a large entourage of expensive and exotic gifts with her. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 2, New King James Version. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. But Solomon's wisdom and wealth were far beyond her comprehension. It took her breath away by the time she had heard his explanations and seen his glorious kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, New King James Version. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. The visiting queen admitted that she had not believed the reports about Solomon that she had heard, but she'd seen for herself that he was the real deal. She then thanked the Lord for putting Solomon on the throne for the sake of Israel. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 6 through 8, New King James Version. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half was not told to me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. Happy are your men, and happy are these your servants, who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom." She also lavished Solomon with gifts, and he appears to have reciprocated. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 9 through 13, New King James Version. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord has loved Israel forever, therefore he made you king, to do justice and righteousness. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. there never again came such abundance of spices as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought great quantities of almug wood and precious stones from Ophir. And the king made steps of the almug wood for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also harps and stringed instruments for singers. There never again came such almug wood, nor has the like been seen to this day. Now King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her according to the royal generosity. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. An interesting insight into the Queen of Sheba is that she did not take people at face value, whether that be on the basis of their self-reports or the reputation that they had garnered from other people. In other words, she wanted to see the results for herself. Another interesting thing the Queen of Sheba demonstrated was that she did not share any of her gifts with Solomon or attempt to strike a closer relationship with him until she was satisfied that he deserved them. Later, Jesus mentioned the Queen of Sheba, also called the Queen of the South, in his condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees. Matthew chapter 12, verse 42. The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here. She was willing to travel hundreds of miles to hear Solomon's wisdom. But while the Son of God far exceeded Solomon in wisdom and glory, the Jewish religious leaders only scoffed at him. According to Jesus, at the final judgment, the Queen of Sheba will point her finger at them in condemnation. They will have no excuse for having rejected the Messiah. Number 5, he built the great temple without making a sound. Perhaps Solomon's most famous act was the construction of the temple with materials and plans provided by his father David. God had promised David that he would allow his son to build the first permanent place of centralized worship, as predicted centuries before in the book of Deuteronomy. It was a magnificent temple and took 7 years to build. It took 12 years to build Solomon's palace, however. Although the temple was constructed out of cut stone, the sound of hammer and chisel was never heard. Thus the temple was erected silently. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7, New King James Version. And the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. For many years, this remained a mystery until someone discovered a massive cave the size of a large theater on Mount Moriah near Calvary outside Jerusalem. Millions of small chips cover the floor where the rock has been cut. The rock is so soft that it can be cut with a penknife, but when exposed to air, it oxidizes and becomes quite hard. All of the stones for the temple came from this cave, where they cut the blocks to fit into the temple above ground. His reign brought great prosperity to the Israelites. The empire stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates and included most of the territory promised to them. The book of Kings, chapter 6, contains a detailed description of the layout of the temple. They can be pretty intricate and technical at times, making it difficult to gain a clear picture of the situation. Nevertheless, we are aware that the construction of the temple followed something like the following. It measured a length of 90 feet with a width of 30 feet and a height of 45 feet. All the lumber and stone for the temple was finished at the quarry to exact specifications so that when brought to Jerusalem, the pieces could be fitted together without iron tools. Nothing but gold was visible inside the temple. In front of the temple was the inner court of the priests. There was a low wall between it and the outer court. This wall consisted of 3 rows of hewn stone and a row of cedar beams. In the inner court was a huge brazen altar for sacrifices. The outer court was for the people of Israel. The temple was begun in the 4th year of Solomon's reign and was finished 7 years later. The images are sometimes grander than we can imagine. The enormous bronze laver that stood in the inner court was known as the Sea of Cast Bronze. The bronze articles were cast in clay in much the same manner as is done today. The furnishings of the holy place included the golden altar of incense, the table of gold, 10 golden tables of showbread, 10 golden lampstands of pure gold, and golden utensils. Solomon was also in charge of the temple's dedication. His dedicatory prayer, which is based on Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, is detailed in Kings. It mentions God's promise to return His people from exile if they return to Him, a promise that became especially important for those in Babylon when the book was published. Solomon was aware that there was no building on earth that could house the great God, but he still prayed that the Lord would recognize this temple and that whenever he or anyone from Israel addressed God there, He would hear and forgive them. This enormous celebration was marked by happiness as well as worship and expressions of gratitude. Not a single one of the thousands of animals was brought before the Lord as a sacrifice for sin or trespass. The cost of the construction of Solomon's temple was not less than $30 million, according to the estimate of Professor Ignaz Alfred Grode of Breslau. The temple, built by King Solomon, was constructed mainly of Egyptian materials and was completed not earlier than 1000 BC, according to the professor's conclusions. King Solomon constructed the temple with great skill, sparing no expense and paying careful attention to every detail. Even the invisible parts were finished to a high standard of quality and accuracy by him. Solomon's reputation spread far and wide, and the magnitude of his power grew substantially as a result of his building program.
This is how Jesus looks in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is unique in comparison to the other books of the New Testament. Not only does it have a message for the church of the first century, to whom it was written, but it also has a message for the church throughout the ages, particularly to those living in the end times who will see Christ return to earth. This one-of-a-kind book was written by the Apostle John, who also contributed 5 other books in the New Testament. This was his last, written just before his death. The title of this book, Revelation, originates from the primary event it describes, which is the manifestation of Jesus Christ to the people living on earth in the final days. The throne of God was the focal point of many of the visions reported by Jewish mystics and apocalyptic seers. But Revelation opens with Jesus as the revealer. John was to document the things that he had seen. John sees a powerful Jesus that does not compare to any typical man. However, before John sets his gaze on Jesus, he first hears his voice. Revelation 1:10-13. I was in the Spirit, in special communication with the Holy Spirit and empowered to receive and record the revelation from Jesus Christ on the Lord's day. And I heard behind me a loud voice like the sound of a trumpet saying, "Write on a scroll what you see in this revelation, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea." Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking with me, and after turning I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands I saw someone like the Son of Man, dressed in a robe reaching to his feet, and with a golden sash wrapped around his chest. This was it. John had seen the Son of Man, the honored Jesus Christ. John describes the loud voice as heard as distinct and striking as the sound of a trumpet. The powerful voice is that of the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, who stands at the beginning and the end of everything. Because Jesus identified himself with these names in Revelation 1:18, we know this was the loud voice of Jesus. The first and the last is a title that belongs to the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel. The title Alpha and Omega has the same idea as first and last. This is one of the New Testament passages where Jesus clearly claimed to be God. We can only imagine what went through John's mind as he turned. The sound of the voice he heard most likely did not match up perfectly with the way he recalled Jesus' voice sounding. John described it as of a trumpet, Revelation 1:10. However, he was aware that it was Jesus because of the voice's description of itself as the Alpha and Omega. After spending so much time with Jesus throughout his ministry on earth, John finally had the opportunity to meet him face to face after all these years. The robe and girdle may evoke images of the high priest from the Bible, and they may also imply that Jesus is the high priest for his people. The only other occurrence of girdles in Revelations is 15:6, also golden, where it is priestly imagery for angels in the heavenly temple. Revelation 15:6. And the 7 angels who had the 7 plagues, afflictions, calamities, came out of the temple, arrayed in linen, pure and gleaming, and wrapped around their chests were golden sashes. This vision is very reminiscent of Daniel 10:5-6. I raised my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose loins were girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz. Thus, Jesus appears not only as a king but as a priest, a combination of images that grew familiar to Jewish people in the Maccabean period. John then continues, "His head and his hair were white like white wool, glistening white like snow, and his all-seeing eyes were flashing like a flame of fire, piercing into my being. His feet were like burnished white-hot bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was powerful like the sound of many waters." Revelations 1:14-15. This description of his eyes is similar to the narrative that we get of an angel in the book of Daniel. Daniel 10:6. His eyes also was like beryl, with a golden luster. His face had the appearance of lightning. His eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and his feet like the gleam of burnished bronze. And the sound of his words was like the noise of a multitude of people or the roaring of the sea. This description of his limbs is similar to the narrative that we get of an angel in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 1:7, Amplified Bible. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like a calf's hoof, and they sparkled and gleamed like shiny bronze. The angelic characteristics that appear in John's visions of Jesus do not bring him down to the same level as angels. Rather, they most likely serve to emphasize Jesus' immense grandeur. He cannot be portrayed as less glorious than a glorious angel. Eyes like fire describe passionate eyes in Greek literature, but they can also depict the supernaturally flaming eyes of divine beings or angels. Glowing metal may also depict God's glory in Ezekiel 1:27. Ezekiel 1:27. Now upward from that which appeared to be his waist, I saw something like glowing metal that looked like it was filled with fire all around it. And downward from that which appeared to be his waist, I saw something like fire, and there was a brightness and a remarkable radiance, like a halo around him. Yet other features suggest that while John portrays Jesus' glory as no less than that of an angel, it is certainly more than that of an angel. Ezekiel 43:2. And behold, the glory and brilliance of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east, and his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. Jesus' title, someone like a son of man, recalls the figure who would reign as God's agent in. Daniel 7:13-14, Amplified Bible. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, on the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him, the Messiah, was given dominion, supreme authority, glory, and a kingdom, that all the people, nations, and speakers of every language should serve and worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Jesus' face also shines like the sun. Greek text sometimes portrays deities shining like the sun or lightning. Jewish text did the same for angels and others, but also for God himself. Revelation 10:1. Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed in a cloud with a rainbow halo over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his feet, legs, were like columns of fire. John then continues in Revelation 1:16. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword of judgment, and his face, reflecting his majesty and the Shekinah glory, was like the sun shining in all its power at midday. Other deities were portrayed as bearing swords, but this image is an allusion to Isaiah 11:4. Isaiah 11:4-5, Amplified Bible. But with righteousness and justice he will judge the poor, and decide with fairness for the downtrodden of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. And righteousness will be the belt around his loins, and faithfulness the belt around his waist. Revelation 1:17. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, and he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, absolute deity, the Son of God." Even though John was an apostle, he had known Jesus while he was on earth. He was overcome with wonder after seeing this incredible vision. Even the 3 years that John lived on the earth with Jesus did not adequately prepare him for the moment when Jesus appeared to him in his heavenly majesty. In that moment, John realized the divine power and majesty Jesus gave up while living on earth. Philippians 2:7, Amplified Bible. But emptied himself without renouncing or diminishing his deity, but only temporarily giving up the outward expression of divine equality and his rightful dignity, by assuming the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men, he became completely human, but was without sin, being fully God and fully man. At this moment, John knew what a miracle it was that Jesus could shield his glory and authority while he walked this earth. Revelation 1:18. And the ever-living one, living in and beyond all time and space, I died, but see, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of absolute control and victory over death and of Hades, the realm of the dead. First, Jesus brought John some solace by touching him compassionately. Perhaps the touch of Jesus felt more familiar than the appearance of Jesus. Then Jesus said to John, "Do not be afraid." John had no reason to be afraid because he was in the presence of Jesus, who clearly identified himself to John with 3 titles. Jesus is the first and the last, the God of all eternity, Lord of eternity past and eternity future. Jesus is the one who lives and was dead and is alive forevermore. He possesses resurrection, credentials, and lives to never die again. The victory that Jesus achieved over sin and death was eternal. He didn't rise from the dead just to die again. Jesus is the only one who possesses the key to Hades and death. Some believe that the devil has the authority of power to decide who lives and who dies. They are obviously mistaken, because only Jesus has the keys to Hades and death. Revelation 1:19. So write the things which you have seen in the vision, and the things which are now happening, and the things which will take place after these things. John is told to write about the past, present, and future. This means that Jesus asked John to write down everything he saw in his vision of the glorious heavenly Jesus. Jesus instructed John to write about the things that were happening in his day, namely the things that pertain to the 7 churches that were located in Asia. We also read, the things which will take place after this. This indicates that Jesus wanted John to report about the things that would occur after the things concerning the 7 churches, the things of the last days. In its original form, Revelation was known in ancient Greek as apocalypsis, apocalypse. The word means a revealing, an unveiling. The book of Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ in the sense that it belongs to him. He is the one doing the revealing. Jesus is the person the book tells us about. Why do we need a revelation of Jesus? The great fault of many professors is that Christ is to them a character upon paper, certainly more than a myth, but yet a person of the dim past, an historical personage who lives many years ago and did most admirable deeds, by the which we are saved, but who is far from being a living, present, bright reality. Spurgeon. We read, which God gave him to show his servants. This is a significant reason why God chose to reveal this information about Jesus Christ to humanity. He gave it to show his servants. God revealed this information so that it may be shared with others and not kept a secret. This is an apocalypse, a revelation, not apocrypha, something hidden. The book of Revelation is a book of predictive prophecy. It makes predictions about things that will take place in the future, or at least in the future relative to the period when it was written. Although not all prophecy may be considered predictive, it is abundantly evident that this prophetic text is. Some would say that we should not be concerned with prophecy, that it is a frivolous exercise. But if God was concerned enough to talk about it, we should be concerned enough to listen. Some tell us that what is yet future ought not to be examined into till after it has come to pass. I can hardly realize that this is seriously meant. Sice.